Let's do an example of a order of operations problem that involves both fractions and decimals. I'm going to actually type this in, so if you want to know how to type in using MathType or an equation editor, I can show you this process, but of course you can also write it. So I'm just using a discussion board, and you wouldn't actually even need to post a discussion board, but this would be one way that you could access MathType. You would just need to choose this little symbol that looks like a square root, and that will enter you into the equation editor. Sometimes, depending on your window, it might not show all these icons. If that's the case, just click on the three dots that are at the end, and then you should see this option come up. So I'm just going to start by typing in our problem. So the first number in this problem is 2/3. So I'm going to just go into my equation editor and choose the fraction option, and I'll type in 2, and then I'm just going to need to use my keyboard keys to arrow down. So just in my keyboard, right, I'm just going to hit the down arrow to get down to the denominator. So arrow down, and then you could also click into it as another way to get into it. And then I'll type in 3. Now, next I'm going to write -1/6, but you have to be careful here. If you start typing in minus, it's going to put that in the denominator, and I don't want that. So each time you do this, you're going to have to, again, use your keyboard. In this case, I'm going to arrow to the right in order to get out of that denominator. So when I'm in that denominator, just arrow to the right, and then that gets me out of the fraction, and I'll type in my minus. And then I'm going to type in the fraction 1/6. Again, you could use this fraction button, but there are some keyboard shortcuts that are really handy, especially if you're typing in a lot of fractions. So what you can do is you can simply use the slash. It's on the same key as the question mark. So if I want to put in 1/6, a fast way to do that would just be 1 and then /6. And if I enter it in that way, the editor knows that I want that as a fraction. Still going to need to arrow out of that fraction though. Next, I'm going to type in a plus sign, and then I want to start a parentheses for this next part. This is going to be 1 and 25/100. So I'm just typing in 1 and then dot or period 25. Then here's my multiplication symbol, and I want the fraction 2/15. So I just did 2/15, and then I'm going to arrow out of my parentheses, and I want to raise this to the second power. So there's an exponent button here. That's one way that you can access this, and then just type in 2. Or you can also use the caret symbol. So once you get out of the parentheses here, the caret symbol is this symbol right here. It's on the same key as the 6, and that will raise to a power. So if you hold down the shift key and then hit the 6, that'll use the caret symbol, which the equation editor interprets that as I want to raise it to a power. So if I do that, it automatically, if you can kind of tell, it moved to the exponent. I'll type in 2, and sure enough, that exponent's a 2. So that's going to be my problem that we're going to solve. So we're going to follow order of operations, which means the first thing we do is our grouping symbols, typically parentheses. That just means that any grouping symbols we have, we're going to work out what's inside them first. So in this problem, I'm going to first do the 1 and 25/100 times 2/15, since that part is inside the parentheses. So I'm just going to hit enter, and I'm going to go down to the next line. Now, you could leave your numbers as decimals, you could leave them as fractions. I would say if they're all decimals, leave them that way. If they're all fractions, leave them that way. My advice is that if you have a mix, usually the best thing to do is go ahead and make them all fractions. If they work out to really nice decimals, you could make them all decimals, but if you have any repeating decimals, that's going to really cause you an issue in terms of you don't want to round your answer because you want an exact answer. So it's just in general best if you've got a mix of decimals and fractions to just convert them all to fractions. So I'm just going to do that off to the side. And this is a good practice, is that when you are going through these order of operations problems, if you need to do kind of some intermediate work, don't do it underneath the problem, kind of go off to the side to do that. So I know to change 1 and 25/100 to a fraction, the easiest way is just to take all the digits in my number and put it over the last place value, in this case the 100th place. So I would put that over 100, and that is 1.25 or 1 and 25/100 as a fraction. And then you could leave it that way, and sometimes it's useful to leave it as an unsimplified fraction, but in general, my advice is that unless you're adding or subtracting, and at this step, I'm not adding and subtracting, I would go ahead and simplify your fraction. So in this case, I'm actually noticing that both the top and the bottom, I could divide by 25. So that would be a nice quick way to simplify that. And so in this case, I get 5/4. So I'm going to go ahead then and type in, I'm going to go back to my equation editor for this next line, and I can see what my previous line is here, and I'm just going to retype this whole thing, except I'm going to replace that 1 and 25/100ths with 5/4. So each time you do this, you're going to bring down every single thing in your problem. And that's really important for students to see that you're bringing it down that way. And like I said, you wouldn't want to show any of those intermediate steps underneath. You could go on another sheet of paper or off to the side someplace. All right, so I still am on my grouping step. I still need to do what's inside the parentheses here, but this is a lot easier now that these are all fractions, and those fractions, at least for right now, are simplified. So I'm going to go ahead and do 5/4 times 2/15. So you have a couple options here when you're multiplying fractions. When you're multiplying, you can, if you realize it, you could simplify any number in the top with any number in the bottom. So for example, I'm noticing that 2 and 4 would simplify. So actually 2 would go into itself 1 time, and 2 would go into 4 2 times. So I crossed out the 4. I know you can't hardly tell that it's crossed out. But I crossed out the 4. I don't want the 2 crossed out, however. And now it's a 2. And then I crossed out the 2 and I have a 1. So 2 went into both of those. I'm also noticing that 5 went into both of these. So 5 goes into itself 1 time. So I'm going to cross out my 5 and leave it with a 1. And then 5 will go into 15 3 times. So I'm going to cross out the 15 and leave it with a 3. And so that's just one way that you could do this. I know again that this is hard to see, but that 4 is crossed out. So now that I've simplified this, I've basically simplified, and now I would multiply. So I could just multiply my numerators and multiply my denominators. 1 times 1 would be 1 in the numerator, and then with that 4 crossed out, this is 2 times 3, which would be 6. So this simplifies to 1/6. So you can simplify and then multiply, or if you don't like that, then just go ahead and multiply and then simplify. We should get the same thing. So just to show what that would look like. So we originally started here, this was 5/4 over 2/15. So if we were just to multiply straight across, 5 times 2 is 10, 4 times 15 is 60, and then simplify, right? So in this case, 10 and 60, I can divide both of those by 10. So 10 divided by 10, and 60 divided by 10, and that's going to give me 1/6. So it's up to you however you want to do that, if you want to simplify and then multiply, or if you want to multiply and then simplify. So what I should be able to do then is I should be able to retype in my equation, but then let's just replace this part with the 1/6. So one fast way to do this would be to actually just copy and paste rather than retype all of that. So if you have a copy option, you can do that. Sometimes there will be a copy option in your choices up here. But then you can also just do the keyboard shortcut, which is Control-C. So if you hold down the Control button and C while this is selected, that will copy it, and then just go down to the next line and paste it. And then I can edit that equation. and then that way I don't have to retype everything. So I'm just going to get rid of the part in parentheses and replace it with what we got, which was 1/6. So it saves me a little bit of time there. So my first step, which is parentheses or grouping symbols, is basically done. I still do have a parentheses here, but since there's only one thing inside of it, it's really just a placeholder for this exponent. So I can move on to my next step, which is exponents, right? So PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or however you best like to remember order of operations, says P, or grouping symbols, parentheses first, then E stands for exponents. So I would do this 1/6 squared. And again, if you want to do some work on that, you can just go off to the side to do that. So there's a couple ways that you can approach this. One thing you could think of is if I'm squaring something, I'm really multiplying it by itself. So this is really the same thing as 1/6 times 1/6. And that's one way to approach it. And then multiply your numerators, multiply your denominators, and you get 1/36. Another way to approach that is you could apply the exponent to both the numerator and the denominator. So if I'm taking the fraction 1/6 and squaring it, I'm really squaring the numerator and I'm squaring the denominator. So this is the same thing as 1 squared over 6 squared. 1 squared is the same as 1 times 1, which is 1. And 6 squared is the same as 6 times 6, which is 36. So however you want to think of that, you're going to get 1/36 there. So again, I'm going to select this, hold down Control C to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it. And if you don't have a shortcut, paste is Control and V, right? Control V will paste. And then I'm just going to edit that step. And I'm going to replace this whole last part here with 1/36, or 1/36. All right, so then let's move on to the next step of my problem. So next in order of operations would be multiplication and division, and they're done together from left to right. So I can see in this particular problem, I don't have any multiplication or division, so I can skip that for this particular problem. So then the last part of order of operations is the AS part, the addition subtraction part. And addition and subtraction are done also together from left to right. So probably the most common mistake here would be that people would say, oh, I'm supposed to do addition and then subtraction. And so then they would add these first and then subtract. That's not correct, right? We do addition, subtraction at the same time. And in terms of how do we determine which one we do first, it's left to right, right? So in this case, since the subtraction is to the left of the addition, we would actually do the subtraction first. Now, I could go ahead and do 2/3 minus 1/6, get a common denominator for those, and then come and do the last step of adding 1/36. But if you get your problem down to all addition and subtraction, what I recommend looking for is see if there isn't a common denominator with all of your fractions. You don't have to do it that way. Like I said, you could find just a common denominator with those first two fractions and then worry about the last one. But a lot of times it is easier that way if you spot something that would work. So if I were just going to do the first part here, 2/3 minus 1/6, that least common denominator would be 6. But if I look at all three fractions, I can actually just change all three to an LCD of 36. And so that's what I'm going to opt to do on this particular problem, is to change each of these to a denominator of 36. All right, so for the fraction 2/3, if I want to get that denominator to be 36, I'm going to need to multiply it by 12, but whatever I do to the bottom, I'm going to have to multiply by the same thing on the top. And so this is actually going to be 24/36. And then on the fraction 1/6, I want to change that denominator to also be my common denominator of 36. I'm going to have to multiply by 6, which means I'm going to have to do the same thing on the top. So that means that I'm going to get 6/36 on that one. So let me just rewrite my problem here. I'm going to copy it, Control C, paste, Control V, and then edit that equation. And so 2/3 we said was really 24/36. And then 1/6 we said was really 6/36. So that's a good next step. And then I'm just going to go ahead and combine those. Now that I have a common denominator, I can just do this all at once, left to right, right? So I would do 24 minus 6. And if you want, you could write that. If you want to go ahead and just do this all in one, it's really okay either way. So 24 minus 6 would be 18. So this would be 18/36. And then I need to add 1/36 to that. And so finally, my answer is going to be 19/36. And always, if your answer is a fraction, just make sure that it is simplified when you're done. In this case, 19/36 doesn't simplify.